So, Mark, I had a topic that I wanted to discuss with you today,
Okay.
which is broadly speaking, what kind of productivity can we expect from a competent professional human being? And does that match with the expectation that people have in general of competent professional human beings? So maybe to give a bit more context, where we've obviously been using sprint points over the last year and a half.
Yep.
So sprint point, as you know, but people watching this might not. A sprint point is a unit of effort that represents amount of work, complexity of work, and uncertainty. So it takes other factors into account than just what's the amount of time in an ideal scenario it would take me to accomplish this task. Um, so a 3 point task might take you 3 hours to accomplish, but it might also take you two. Ideally, it shouldn't take you five because then it would have been a higher complexity task. But it's a more effective way of estimating how much time something's going to take. A certain amount of time is going to a certain amount of work is going to take, and so from that 1.5 years worth of data, roughly, we've seen that most people on our team do somewhere around 32, 33 points worth of work per sprint. It's more realistic to say 30. That's sort of a more safe um, safe amount to go for. Of course, people will have weeks where they'll do 40 points or even 45, 50 points, but usually they're completely overworked at the end of that sprint.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to reflect on the fact that we're assuming that if when we sign this contract that says you will be working 37 and a half or 38 or 40 hours a week, whatever your contract says, depending on the country you live in, um, if you've got a full-time job, that there's a mismatch between what we observe in terms of people's productive time, if you will, and the amount of time we're theoretically paying them to work. Now, I'm not saying people are slacking for half a day a week, not at all. My point of view is more that we shouldn't be expecting people to work or to produce output, to strictly produce output for every single minute of every single day that they're working, because we know there's going to be disruptions. People need to get into stuff, need to concentrate themselves. It takes time to get into a new task, etc. And so, those 15 minutes in between meetings that you'll have, or that half hour that you have in between two tasks, usually
Will
doesn't.
add up. Will add up over the week.
And also the thing is, even if you're working in those 15 or 30 minutes, those are not the same as if you'd had 2 hours blocked to work on that task and you take the productivity on those 45 minutes in that 2 hour block. Those 15 minutes plus 30 minutes aren't going to be as productive as 45 minutes out of a bigger block. And so I think that question of what kind of productivity should we expect from a competent and motivated, right? Don't get me wrong, a motivated professional.
I think
Um,
that's making me think of a number of things here. And there's been studies on how long a human can focus um, in an amount of minutes, whether that's
yep,
45 or an hour or something like that,
yep.
before their mind wanders and potentially by definition they become less productive.
Hmm.
Um, I not sure many people can be at 100% productivity for 8 hours straight, because they'll need a lunch break. They'll, that their focus is going to dip, is going to go up and down over time.
Yep.
And in terms of kind of, I suppose, your own mental health, or not getting, kind of worn out by the day, you should take breaks. And especially, I think, if you're working remotely, it's not healthy to be sitting down for 8 hours. And there's other stuff out there that talks about different types of rest, which I think we've covered in one of our previous videos. But also, I'm reading some stuff about how we be more active, and making sure that you get up regularly to go and get a drink, and that might only be 5 minutes or even 2 minutes, but you get up, your blood circulation goes, you have that little break, which in theory, that investment of break time increases the percentage that you are productive for the time after that break.
Yep.
So I don't think you're ever going to get, if we are equating, and I think it's obviously problematic, as I think you've identified already, problematic to think that if a sprint point is 1 hour, that someone is going to be achieving 7.5 or eight sprint points in their 7.5 or 8 hour day. That sounds really unrealistic to me, because there's no way that someone's going to be at that level of productivity for that time.
Yeah. And the stereotypical old school manager persona sort of character in my head, with whom I'm theoretically having a dialogue, is saying, or the way I see it is saying, oh yeah, but I'm not paying them to take a break, right? That shouldn't be part. If they're taking 15 minutes, especially working from home, if they're taking 15 minutes to go walk the dog, or go to the shop, or go get a coffee or whatever, they should work 15 minutes more at the end of the day, right?
Yeah,
I'm paying them.
There's logic there.
There is a logic to that, but I don't think that's the contract or the agreement you have with that employee. I think, and I mean, this is the way we're applying it, that break and that time that you need to be productive is part of what we're actually paying you to do, right? Because we want you to be a productive member of our company. So whatever you need to do in order for that to happen, is part of what we need you to do for your job, effectively.
Well, I mean, and I think there's a business case for people taking breaks in that sense, because I think if you did some sort of measure where your staff on a more microscopic level rated their productivity over time, if you like, so every 10 minutes rated their productivity rating out of 10, and I think that would be problematic, because it would probably interrupt their productivity.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I think you get the concept that we had some sort of measure of that didn't interrupt them.
Yeah.
You would see that if they didn't have the right sort of rest or break or change in task, for example,
Yeah.
that productivity level from, let's say, a theoretical 100% when you're fresh and you've had breakfast and you're raring to go in the morning, would be dropping and dropping and dropping and dropping and dropping. Whereas if you take a break, or you change your task, or you chat about a little bit of bullshit with a colleague for 10 minutes, that could, I think, theoretically bring that back up to 90, 100% again, which means that investment of 15 minutes has the overall effect is that your percentage for the day is higher than it would have been if you'd worked straight the way through. That's my theory.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with that, and I'm so what I'm where my head's going is, we're in this setup where, and when we just talked about this just before, where we're telling people this is the amount of work I expect you to do in a week. When you do that work, I don't care, unless we've got an engagement with a customer to be on a call, or we've got a team meeting, or something like that.
Yeah.
You can work midnight, you can work in the weekend, you can work at 5 in the morning. I really don't care, as long as you get the amount of work done that I expect out of you as as your role, however we've defined that role. So that theoretically makes it problematic to evaluate what's that amount, right? Because if I'm saying you you should produce 32 sprint points, right? And if I'm doing like I do, right, 45-minute, 1 hour meetings, relatively back to back, I've got half an hour here, an hour there in between meetings, and then every now and then an afternoon that I block out to do some sort of concentrated, focused work. It might take me in total 2 or 3 hours to do a 2-point task, or it might take me an hour and a half to do a 1-point task, just because it's spread out, or I've got 15 minutes, takes me 5 minutes to get into it, 5 minutes to prepare for the next meeting. So effectively, it's taken me 15 minutes to have 5 minutes of productive time, if you will. But then someone else who's working in a more disparate way, if you will, who does 2 hours of concentrated work in the morning, then goes and has a workout outside, goes for a walk, has a chat with a friend, comes back, does another 2 hours of concentrated work in the afternoon, then has, I don't know, another, maybe it's dinner time, I don't know. Basically, they chunk up their work, and so they get these breaks in between and this more concentrated work. Effectively, maybe they get the amount of work done in 80% of the time,
Yeah.
of mine, or 70% of the time, I don't know. But what's the benchmark? Because if you're telling me you should be taking regular 15-minute breaks because that increases your productivity, and basically we're now benchmarking on people that don't, such as myself, right? Or someone else who maybe doesn't have an entirely optimized routine to increase their productivity. Does that mean, sorry, I'm rambling a little bit because I'm also formulating my thought as I go, but does that mean that we are then underperforming as a team because we're benchmarking against somebody who's underperforming, in which case we then never question me about what can we do to increase your performance? Maybe you should take more breaks. Are you with me, or am I too rambly? It kind of makes sense in my head, but
Yes, sort of. I mean, well, I think you said what is the part of the question start off with what is a productive professional, and the problem is no company or no individual is 100% optimized. So nobody is as productive as they could be.
yeah.
So where is this mean? Where is this average professional threshold
Yeah.
that is acceptable within a business? And how do you find that to guide you? Because another thing comes into my mind with regards to people with disabilities,
Yep.
especially people with learning disabilities. Because theoretically, I might do a particular job faster than someone with a learning disability. But does that mean that we always then should choose the person who doesn't have a learning disability, which means nobody with learning disabilities has a job, or is that?
So at least what I'm trying to determine is if we want to be able to tell people, I don't care when you do your work as long as you do the amount of work that we've
Yeah,
agreed you would do,
yeah.
we need a good way of determining what that amount of work is.
And historically, that is hours worked,
Historically, that's hours worked,
which
and
is potentially problematic because, for example, I can't remember which country it was, but a number of countries have started to reduce their
mm,
working week down to 4 days, and then they found that the productivity on whatever measures they've done it before is as much on 4 days as 5 days, which seems to support our theory that people's brains are turning off if they are made to work for too long in a row. And maybe this also has other life work-life balance that almost allow that flexibility, because that company, they can come in later, which means they miss the rush hour, which means they have longer with their family and they're less strained, so their productivity on when they are working is higher. So where is this where is this optimal level of working, and yeah, like you say, what is the amount that is an acceptable amount or a standard amount that is expected for someone?
yeah, because the issue then comes if we say, um, right, Mark, you work 2.5 days a week for IQM.
Yeah,
Um, an average person at IQM who works full time gets about 32 points done. So we expect you to do 16 points because effectively
yeah,
that's half of it, right?
yeah,
Now in practice, you've been doing on average 18 to 20 points, right?
yeah.
Um, so does that mean you're working more than 2.5 days a week on average? Possibly. Or does it mean that you're just more productive in those 2.5 days and effectively, like you're saying, people not having a change um, of scenery, of context, a break potentially every now and then means that actually having them work for 5 days straight is less effective per day than having them work for 2.5 days and then having a short break. You know, and the other way around, if we were to say, well, hang on, guys, Mark's doing 20 points in 2.5 days. Surely everybody should be doing 40 points if they're
Yeah.
working full time. So that there is that issue. Um, if our benchmarking or if our measurement system isn't entirely working, and I know these are a bit abstract cases, but we are using all of these point values to estimate how long a certain amount of work will do on the roadmap, right? And so allocating 1 week or 2 weeks or 12 days to a certain project. And so if those benchmarks are off, then our planning is going to be off.
Yeah.
So it has an impact on the business, and it can have an impact on individuals and that kind of stuff, which is why it's an interesting topic. I don't think we'll figure it out, if you will, now,
No,
but um,
it's interesting with regards to the part-time working, because I have a number of cases of where I think part-time workers are more efficient
yep,
um, in terms of their productivity, on average per hour, which brings up an interesting point, that maybe you could increase productivity in a team if you take on two part-time workers rather than one full-time worker. Just throwing that out there as a as a potential thing, if you like. And I think a lot of companies are still resistant to part-time
yeah.
workers, but maybe you get an efficiency gain. Maybe you don't with all of them. I'm sure you don't with everybody, but yeah, made
No,
me think of that.
because there's, especially for part time, obviously there's a balance between um, an efficiency or a productivity gain and how much time is spent in those regular meetings or rituals versus the
Onboarding,
amount of productive time.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
out of those 20 points that you do, how many of those are spent in sprint meetings? How many of those are spent in recurring meters?
a higher percentage than someone who's full time.
There we
Yeah,
go. So it's also balanced, but it's an interesting topic, right? Because um, I'm theoretically for 4 days a week. Now we know I don't work 4 days a week. I work 5 days a week. However, I do by default have my workday run from 10 to 5 or 10 to 4. If I can't avoid it, then I'll have meetings that run until 6, but I very 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 rarely finish at 6. Um, and I do more often start before 10, but it's also the exception. It's not the rule.
yeah.
And I have less of an issue sometimes taking an hour or 2 hours out of my day um, to go and run an errand or have a call with a friend or whatever. So I'm also definitely not working full time, right? However, I am very often one of the higher producing team members in terms of sprint points. Um, so, for instance, last week I did 38 points and I was off on Friday. I didn't work. I mean, I did 2 points because I was dialing into a call on the train, but I didn't do any other work than that on Friday. So I was really part-time last week and I did still do 38 points. Now I had one day where I started at 7:30 and ended at 6, so that was a really long day, but the other days were okay. Um, so yeah, maybe there is an argument to be made for less full-time, you know, rather than maybe rather than completely um, half-time or because at a certain point you start to lose efficiency with how many meetings you need to have internally to align compared to the amount of work people can do, productive as in producing stuff, um, work. But yeah.
Difference between having a 2 day weekend and having a 3 day weekend.
Hmm.
To look at the 4 day working week where people are paid the same, but they have a 4 day instead of a 5 day. That is a massive difference for someone's life in terms of sorting out the other stuff and being able to socialize and all of that.
Hmm.
And I suspect that in a lot of cases, that individual that's had 3 days off returns back to work less distracted and more refreshed. And therefore, by definition, if they're obviously engaged in their work, by definition, would probably mean they're more productive for the 4 days that they're in.
So we're saying we're getting everybody to work 4 days at IQM now.
I, I think I think it's early to say that,
Mm.
I think it also does depend on someone's profile
Yeah.
in terms of how much that might affect their productivity. But from someone, I've made a choice to work 2.5 days, partly because I'm involved in a number of other projects, but also because I have a family and 3 children, and I need some of those other days or parts of those other days to tackle stuff that comes up. And if I couldn't tackle those things in those other days, that would impinge on my work time and would cause me stress and wear me
Mm.
out, which I think it does to a lot of people who are juggling a vast range of things.
Yeah. No, I think so too. Um,
I'm not unique as a parent with 3 children by any stretch of the imagination, but I've I think, been fortunate in some ways, but also made choices to configure my week in a certain way that gives me some of that extra capacity to deal with some of those things that come in. So I have those days, which is kind of Monday and Friday afternoon, where theoretically I keep almost clear in my calendar. Stuff always comes up, but I haven't got it booked to capacity, and then things always come up, and then I'm under strain, and could be constantly under strain.
Yeah. Now I think because just today we made the decision or put forward the proposal to build in this buffer in our weekly routine or planning routine, let's call it,
Yep.
in our sprints, to say let's make sure that we more often than not have time left over at the end of the sprint, rather than be short, run over, and then impact other elements on the roadmap. And the main rationale behind that was in order for us to keep more time to work on strategic long-term projects, because the roadmap would be less impacted. However, based on what we're saying now, that might actually also increase people's productivity, this decreased work pressure, if that makes sense. People might get more done if we tell them to do less, if that makes sense.
And especially linking in with what Stuart said, with one of our staff that has a particular motivation to do something, that time that will appear at the end of a sprint sometimes, because it won't appear all of the time. It's
No.
there as a buffer partly because of unknown stuff that regularly comes in, which means we'll then still deliver because we have that buffer time. But in the times that a sprint is finished on time and you don't need to use that buffer, that potentially gives someone a little bit of extra capacity to work on something that really motivates them. That is still is still being classified as something that the business needs, but is something that is a little bit more driven by their motivation to do it. And again, that will, I'm sure, raise overall motivation levels.
I would just want to reflect on something, which is that from what I've written on the board, based on what we've been talking about, we haven't mentioned minimize disruptions. So yes, not concentrating for long enough is one of the first things that you mentioned, or trying to stay focused for too long, which is the opposite. At least that first one could be interpreted as don't get yourself interrupted all the time. But I don't think that's exactly what we were saying. And I also don't think that, if it happens all the time, of course, but neither of us thinks that disruptions are necessarily always a bad thing. And also, I think it's a bit futile to try and fight it, because you're going to get disrupted one way or another.
Yeah.
Might as well roll with the bunches rather than going back to the discussion we had about adaptability and being able to adjust to unanticipated stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you could not plan at all and be super adaptive and deal with everything. That's not the best approach.
No.
In the business we're running. And you could plan for absolutely everything, every minute kind of thing, put loads of resources into planning to absolutely minimize the disruptions to as little as possible. That's not the right way to work. So there's a balance there. You want to have good planning, and it's reminded me of this kind of graph again, where you is it the what's it called? Diminishing returns.
Mm-hmm.
So we're trying to hit this sweet spot of planning, where we get the most out of our planning for the time that we put into it, and to reduce disruptions. But we know that we can't completely avoid disruption, so we also need to be adaptable enough to deal with those disruptions when they come in.
Yeah. Yeah. It's this whole what's it called? I think it's part of Kanban, is that the more you plan to capacity, the more you're getting delayed, which comes from sort of a manufacturing environment. If you plan your assembly line to capacity, then you're going to get more delays than if you plan your assembly line to 80%.
Isn't it? Isn't it also? I'm just made me think of this, so I'll just throw it out there. Isn't that also against agile
Yeah.
methodology in a sense? Because the waterfall kind of methodology is plan for everything, plan the final product, if you like. And actually, the agile methodology is plan in segments, and fail and adapt and find out what works and tweaks as you go along. So potentially, if we plan to complete capacity, even if it's within agile methodology and sprints, which is obviously segmenting things, you are potentially opening yourself up to committing to something that is a complete thing and not giving yourself any capacity to adapt.
Yeah. Okay. Any closing thoughts or conclusions that you want to take away from this?
Well, I was initially thinking when you had proposed this topic, and I mentioned it before we started to roll the camera, that I wasn't sure how I was going to be creative on this and and be able to discuss around this thing, but it triggered a number of responses and areas of interest actually, and I think it is a really interesting area, and it's worth us investing a certain amount of time on your little graph there, to understand this and to tweak this, because if we find an effective way of working that increases productivity and people remain happy and motivated, then as our company grows, that should be a scalable approach, which will mean that we will be more effective as a company. So I think it's worth us having a think about this and revisiting it. I mean, to be fair on us, we are frequently touching on these sort of things and tweaking our process. I think we have over the last year, from when we first, I suppose, properly started to use the agile project management methodology when we took on ClickUp. Our process has become much more streamlined. We've got these little extra bits which don't take long to do and have a positive effect and give us more data to look back on.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's data that started this discussion
in the first place.
Yeah. So I'm confident that we will be able to continue improving and leveraging it. And for me, for one, I think it's very interesting that we, without any conscious effort, as a team, we calibrated all kind of to the same amount of points that we do in a week. Some people are a little bit below it on average, but then consistently, which for me is fine as well. As long as you do the same thing roughly, then it makes it predictable and we can plan with it. So yeah, no, it's.
I mean, I think to answer your initial question, how do you work out what is a productive amount or the right amount of points for the team to be doing? The answer isn't a number. The answer isn't static. It is, we have this in our awareness as a team. We discuss it when it comes up, and we think about it, because sometimes it might drop and we might question why, and there might be a very relevant thing in the environment that is causing that. So I think that's answering it without answering it, if you like. It is something that you need to continually be kind of aware of and be open to discuss.
Yeah.
Because we could start up a new office in Japan, let's say, just throwing it out there. Maybe it's some cultural bias going to come out here, or Germany, and they join the company, and all a particular culture of workers are then doing more points on average than the UK workers. I don't know. There's going to be these differences between people, cultures, countries, but I think that we have the feeling that the people in the businesses we have at the moment are working hard, and are being productive. Now, do we want them to work harder? Probably not, because there's people that are possibly working too hard sometimes, and that might affect them in the long run. Could they be more productive? I'm sure we can tweak some things to increase productivity.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mark, for another interesting conversation. And I'm looking forward to our first guest.
Yes.
On the PVT sometime soon.
Yep. Excellent. Yeah, I look forward to that as well. We've got a range of people in mind from our networks that we think we could have some really, really interesting and maybe some challenging conversations with.
All right.